So, good afternoon, and welcome to this historic moment, this nightmare rather than a dreamland. But it's sometimes good to move from nightmares to dreams. And actually, there are some dreams going on out there which seems very promising for the present and for the future. So, welcome to our first lecture in the Armenian Studies program community by our Manoogian postdoc. The Armenian Studies program was so impressed by David Lowe's work that we invited him 2 years in a row. And we are thrilled that he has joined our community this year. David comes to us from the Cortland Institute of Art, where he received his PhD in 2015. David's dissertation, entitled Framing the Armenian Genocide, Photography and the Revisualization of the Ottoman Empire, studies HFB Lynch's journeys to the Ottoman Empire in the 1890s. Lynch was a British writer and photographer who inserted Armenians and the genocide into the history of Middle Eastern photography. Creating an archive of Armenia and Armenians, Lynch came to represent Armenians to the West at a critical moment of world history, namely during the First World War. David studies Lynch's archive to write Armenian history and explore the way in which these images have shaped the vision of Armenia in the West. David's work reads the production of photographs not simply as a medium to record history, but as active agents within social and political processes. Both meticulous and imaginative, David is a pioneer in the study of how photography visualizes erasures in Armenian genocide studies, at the same time as it enriches and questions the field of visual culture. Part of David's current project is a revisiting of Lynch's traveled terrain, following in the footsteps of the photographer to create a contemporaneous survey of Lynch's archive. In so doing, David intends to both complement and reflect on Lynch's work to tease out the afterlife of Lynch in a post-genocide context where remains of churches and homes, once lived spaces, have a new life in the Turkish Republic, where ruins of Armenian everyday lives have been appropriated for state-sponsored nationalist projects. David's innovative methodology combines photography with landscapes to perform a cultural history of Armenian afterlives. And he will be talking to us now. I think the past, in a way, is about difference. So we're also engaging in solidarity with these movements of BAM and Black Lives Matter outside that is happening. So please join us in welcoming David Lowe. It seems to belong to Dreamland rather than reality.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Is that on? Yes. Thank you, Catherine. Thank you very much. It's very nice to be here. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. I appreciate there are other things going on. So thank you for joining us. If anyone does want to walk out, I will not be offended. So please, please carry on as normal. I'm very pleased to be here. Thank you very much, Catherine, for the lovely introduction. And thank you also to Catherine and the Armenian Studies program for having me this year in Ann Arbor as a postdoctoral fellow. I'm very pleased to be here and already enjoying a productive time. And I also see some colleagues and friends from the History of Art department. So thank you very much to the History of Art department for housing me and looking after me this year. And also to say, that this is also a slightly new project. So I hate to argue against how I've been introduced, but some of this, there was a small section of my PhD thesis on Lynch, but mostly this is very, very new work. So this is a work still in progress, very much in progress, A lot of this work has been done in the last few months. And so also to thank the Kalous Gulbenkian Foundation, a generous grant from them over the summer allowed me to make headway on a lot of this work. So it is fresh and in progress, so please forgive it not being completely fully realized at times, but I look forward to presenting some of it to you today. Okay, so my theme is HFB Lynch, and photography is my field, my general area. There is a theme this year about orphans, and I'm thinking here about orphaned fields, the field of art history and photographic history, which is generally neglected. And also, I'm particularly interested in orphaned photographs. These are images that become separated from their point of origin. It is true, broadly speaking, of all photographs, for it is in their nature to travel, to be reproduced, repackaged, reimagined, and to have new narratives projected onto them. And it is more true of older photographs from other eras, especially those made before cataclysmic events. Strangely, the more history photographs accrue, the more ahistorical they become. In the great gulf between now and then, original intention, meaning, and context becomes lost. So in the Armenian case, we find photographs reproduced in support of numerous enterprises, including scholarly essays where they tend not to be addressed as sources, but rather used as illustrations. And particularly we find them reproduced in memorial books, assemblages of disparate images and texts that imaginatively reconstruct a lost world. And we find the images of HFB Lynch used a fair amount for this. And here we're looking at the Hushamadian website, a modern incarnation of the Hushamadian genre, the memorial book genre. So I see it as part of my job to collect up these orphans and return them home. This is not to argue that there exists anything like true meaning in photography. In fact, what draws me to photographs is the sheer multiplicity of meaning. We might even go so far as to describe this fluidity as the condition of photography. But in a world of stories and memories, those of the photographer seem at least a good place to start. And indeed, in uncovering this narrative of the photographer, the original narrative, if you like, we might reiterate how photographs are never neutral documents. As James Ryan states in his work on 19th century colonial exploration, in spite of claims for its accuracy and trustworthiness, photography did not so much record the real as signify and construct it. So the title of my lecture today comes from words reported by Minas Charas, a man who had been secretary to the Armenian delegation in Berlin in 1878, and who was by the 1890s based in London as a writer, editor, and political activist. In an 1894 article, he refers to a meeting with the businessman and explorer HFB Lynch, recently returned to Great Britain after his first Armenian expedition. And he records Lynch's words to him: "I am always revisiting in thought those great mountains and silent lakes. What a majestic and solemn country is yours. It seems to belong to dreamland rather than reality." Now, Lynch, with all good reason, has been associated with the Victorian commitment to scientific accuracy, and yet here he seems to suggest, perhaps unwittingly, the personal construction of an idea of place. So one of the questions I ask today is, what is the nature of Lynch's dream of Armenia? And what can an examination of this dream tell us about the dreamer himself? I pay attention above all to Lynch's book Armenia, Travels and Studies, a 2-volume work published in 1901, the result of his 2 expeditions to the region. The first in 1893, as I've mentioned, in which he went along the Black Sea and from Trebizond today, went to Batumi, Akarasika, down to Alexandropol, Gyumri, Yerevan, Echmiadzin, Ani, Kars, Van, Bitlis, Mush, Erzurum, and then back to Trabzon. And then also an 1898 journey in which he went in reverse, starting in Trabzon, went down to Erzurum and spent an extended period around the region north of Lake Van. So this resulted in the book Armenia Travels and Studies, and perhaps even in this subtitle of his, Travels and Studies, we might see the existence of different operations. And I'll be thinking about his varied uses of photographs, including how the camera was employed, again following on here from James Ryan, as a means of visualizing the romance as well as the science of exploration. So I will start near the beginning, at an early stage of Lynch's journey in 1893 in Kutaisi, today Kutaisi, Georgia, where he writes of the unfolding of an extensive panorama. And I will quote you here. Sorry, it is a slightly long quote, but I think it's important. He writes, "I shall therefore take my reader to some convenient standpoint. Let us say the cliffs on the right bank of the Rion and the hill upon which the massive ruins of the cathedral rise on the skyline above the leafy breaks. Figure 6a, he tells us. I can show you the position from the opposite bank of the river in a picture which was taken over a mile above the town from the road which ascends the valley. Figure 6. The Rion is flowing from you into the middle distance coming from the north. Kutaisi itself is hidden by a wooded promontory. Figure 6d. But you see the group of buildings which compose the Armenian and the Catholic churches and which crown the extreme northerly projection of the site. Figure 6b. 3 bridges span the Rion, where it sweeps past the town, confined between lofty banks, and lead from the busy streets to the peaceful heights, which overlook them and command all the landscape of the plain. I cannot imagine a more charming walk than by the hill church of St. George, figure 6c, to the pleasant eminence which I have already described." So a slightly long quotation there, but I think it's necessary to show how we have several different things going on here at once. The construction of a picturesque image, foliage, wooded banks, flowing water which leads us straight into the image and its distant sites, with all these elements also reiterated by Lynch in his text. But at the same time, as the image is lovingly tied together, it is also dissected and drawn up almost grid-like to bring out its raw information. We might thus see the picture as both scientific view and artistic landscape. And there is more, for Lynch is talking about taking the reader with him, a narratival device to situate them in space and carry them along with him as a simulation of the journey. These we might refer to as the armchair travelers, those reading Lynch's work at home, and he does often specifically refer to his readers, but they would also have been those attending his illustrated lectures. And it is in those circumstances, as Magic Lantern shows, much like this one here, that Lynch would have first taken viewers to Armenia imaginatively by way of his photographs. So he continues, "We reach our point, and there before us expands the open landscape of which the second photograph embraces a considerable part." He again dissects this second image, which is, he's told us exactly where he's taken it from, and now he shows us the image and he dissects this image, pointing out the individual details and features and alluding to the journey to come, a journey into the distant mountains. Thus using this photograph in the same way as he used the previous one, to situate viewers both in relation to his photograph and in relation to views to come in the future, providing a physical sense of the space through which they will imaginatively travel. But there is again another operation underway, for he continues, "Let us realize for a moment the meaning of the landscape and allow the mind to assist the eye. The opposite mountains belong to the girdle of ranges which buttress the Armenian tableland." So his references to the eye and the mind are telling. He's endeavoring not only to describe space, but to invest it with meaning. That there in the distance, he tells us, that is Armenia. This is one of the actions we see Lynch performing with photographs, naming and defining space, giving significance to geography and natural formations. And we can very much associate this with his parallel activities as a map maker. And here we're looking at his map of what he defines as the natural frontiers of the Armenian plateau. So we see Kutaisi right at the top here, and he was looking southwards towards these mountains, towards Armenia. This is the point we were just looking at. So these two go hand in hand. So these are the great mountains of which Lynch spoke in that conversation with Minas Tirith, and they serve as a means of demarcating and defining Armenia. Mountains are used by Lynch to conjure up an image of an ancient and mysterious land, and he particularly uses Ararat, which he shrouds in a quasi-mysticism. He emphasizes this sense of the unknown in his introduction, describing how his travels had been driven by the inducement of curiosity to find out what lay beyond those mountains. And such foregrounding of the unknown acts as well to give definition to the traveller himself. Lynch was active at the tail end of the Victorian era that had witnessed the dramatic increase in mountaineering activity, the tackling and conquering of the unknown as part of an expression of imperial masculinity, and what Lynch terms the British spirit of adventure. This confrontation with the natural world was given expression by the Alpine Club, of which Lynch was a member, and books such as this 1897 volume, to which Lynch contributed a chapter about his ascent of Ararat. And the ascent of Ararat is one of the centerpieces of the first volume. And even when he's not directly dealing with Ararat, Ararat looms as a great presence and over the book, and indeed as a target, with Lynch describing almost a slow stalking of the great mountain. Now, the frontispiece here stands as a fairly typical piece of heroic aggrandizement, but to be fair to Lynch, he does not mythologize himself in quite the same way. He does not perform the part of the explorer for the lens, and is in fact nowhere to be seen within his photographs. Instead, we find him making photographs such as this, which he made on the descent from the peaks of Ararat. So on his descent, he gazes back up the mountain from a viewpoint that emphasizes the difficulty of the terrain. He again dissects and annotates the image for the benefit of his readers. Yet here he is not so much naming land and its features as actually signaling his own dominance of them, writing his route and achievement, the conquest of Ararat, into the image. You see here, right at the top, it's almost a flag planted at the top of the mountain. And on his ascent, he comes across various markers that previous climbers have used to inscribe the landscape, and he makes fairly regular reference to those that have traveled the region before him. He is aware of their historical presence, either through the knowledge that he carries with him, owing to the vast amount of research he undertook before departure, or through the traces they have left, such as in the way of mountain markers. And Lynch, through his photographs, adds his own traces to the land. Mountains, thus, play different roles for Lynch, and we know of their importance in the most basic sense, owing to the simple fact that they were photographed by him. The man himself tells us that photography is reserved for only those things deemed to be special. In Akalkalaki, present-day Georgia, he asks how he might present my reader with a picture of a settlement which is nothing more than an agglomeration of one-storied, flat-roofed houses, placed, as it were, at random on the floor of the plain. It seems ridiculous to focus the camera on such an insignificant object. So to photograph something then is to proclaim the significance of the thing photographed, and in a peculiar reversal, to bestow significance upon the thing. So we might thus begin to look at the traveller's collection of photographs as a pure distillation of an idea of place, a singling out of vital aspects. This has its basis in the physical practicalities of 19th century photography. Lynch, using a glass plate process, was limited in terms of the resources that he could carry on the journey, and thus had to be selective about what he photographed. Even so, he still managed to accumulate what he describes as a collection which fills several cases, and he explains that the images that appear in the book are a selection from this collection, showing how the substantial but necessarily limited number of images Lynch was able to create was whittled down further during the editing process. Thus we have in the final book something of a pure essence, a distillation of a distillation, and an examination of the images informs us what for Lynch necessitated representation, what for Lynch was Armenia. So mountains are the focus of his interaction with the natural world, And at the centre of his consideration of the built environment, as he turns away from the insignificant villages and their dwellings, are Armenian churches. Churches were handy evidence for Lynch and many in pro-Armenian circles of what they saw as the most prominent features of Armenian identity: Christianity, civilization, creativity, and also longevity. They were read as the signs of a people's long presence on the land, seen almost as natural, timeless features of the land. In fact, not only do churches and mountains constitute Lynch's two great recurring motifs, but they also at times go hand in hand. And often, of course, this is due to the fact that Armenian churches tend to be found in mountainous areas. But even elsewhere, he's constructing these metaphors of the natural environment and the built environment. So here we are at Etchmiadzin. Through a turn of 180 degrees and the subsequent printing of the resultant images facing each other in his book, Lynch constructs parallel images of the cathedral of Etchmiadzin and Ararat, both viewed jutting over trees across water. The dome and belfry of the former mimic the peaks of the latter. And in this way, churches are seen as an expression of the land itself, almost as innate organic features. While some Armenian buildings are depicted as having sprung from the land, others are found in the midst of returning to it. Sorry, this is, I've had to rely on some PDFs here just to show you the layout of the book. So there is some better images. And some buildings are depicted as returning to the land. In Tallinn, still in present-day Armenia, not so far away from Etchmiadzin, Lynch surveys a church, which, although in ruins, is fairly well preserved. The roof has fallen in, the walls display wide breaches, but the masonry is still sharp and fresh, as when first put together. It is thus held, this church in Tallinn, in a contradiction between past and present, presence and absence, preservation and destruction. Lynch finds the ground strewn with fallen stones, some red, others grey, the two colours which are so skillfully blended or placed in contrast by Armenian architects upon the broad, undecorated spaces of their walls. So Lynch regularly harnesses inherent tensions of ruinous sites to express an idea of a decaying culture. With a product of careful, creative acts, these places are signs of Armenian creativity, but they end in chaotic decay. So he is also mapping a path from the Armenian past to the Armenian present. And ruins are a perfect device for his constant refrain of fallen greatness, as he maps through the work this gulf between the past and the present. And you might remember his choice of words during that conversation with Minas Tirith. What a majestic and solemn country is yours. Majestic and solemn, these two descriptive terms, they're not quite contradictory, but they're not also at the same time completely happy bedfellows. And like mountains, churches point in different directions. Lynch presents himself in his appreciation of these sites as a connoisseur, both of architecture and of ruin, aligning himself with European ruin lust, which, as with mountaineering, had its basis in cults of the sublime and the picturesque. And we find in Samsun, in today's Turkey along the Black Sea coast, when he was first starting on his journey, he looked for a massive tower of old acquaintance, only to find it gone, but for a few scattered blocks of stone upon the ground. These, he writes, testify rather to the carelessness of the Turkish building contractor than to any respect on the part of his employers for the beauty and interest of the town. So ruins are something that the European can appreciate. We have this construction of certain racialized characteristics. The Armenians are builders and creators. The Turks are often destroyers. It's not just that they don't appreciate the beauty of ruins, but often they ruin in the first place. And the Europeans are the connoisseurs who can see the beauty of these sites. So ruin also informed a vision of photography for Lynch. Photography is preserving endangered heritage. And while some of Lynch's images and phrasings portray an eye for the picturesque, He also shows a desire simply to collect information. Here we are at Atama in Lake Van. So again, we can see several things going on here. We have the church from the southeast, and then in sequence, church from the northwest and sculptures on the north wall. What these images allow us to do is to see he takes the viewer basically around the church from the southeast to the opposing view on the northeast, and then he moves in on what is this wall right here, showing a relief of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden and the snake there. So this is again his simulation of the journey, and also we can map Lynch's own journey. He would have, since the island is on the south of Lake Van, he would have taken a boat and arrived on the south of the island, and therefore this first image is the view, or close to the view he would have been presented with when he first arrived. But also we see how he moves around and takes in a close-up view. So essentially, he's turning from the long view to the close-up view to the details. And again here, we find him moving from this is Ani, the church of St. Gregory of Tigran-Honents, from an atmospheric view to a close, detailed rendering of a stone relief. Now, these are not actually the same sites. The stone relief comes from the cathedral, which at the time he describes as being something of a museum. So he's photographed, sometimes he photographs individual pieces in situ in walls, other times like this, where this has been propped up in the cathedral, either by Lynch himself or by someone else, and then photographed. And then he goes further by, so he isolates the stone molding first in the photograph and then again on the page, where it's locked in the display case of the text. The stone relief is reconfigured as a museum exhibit, and the traveler's job becomes one of cataloguing artifacts and rescuing them from oblivion. These images suggest the camera as a tool of documentation and preservation. Perpetuation is the term that Lynch employs. So again, treating these sites as museum objects as worthy of preservation characterizes Armenians as artists, as creators, and it characterizes the European visitor as the one who rescues and perpetuates the doomed civilization. And just a few pages further on in his account of Ani, he presents an interesting passage concerning one of the churches of the citadel. His photograph of a pilaster demonstrates, he writes, the inaccuracies of another traveller there, Brosset, the French Orientalist who was there in the 1840s. So Lynch compares his own photograph to a drawing made there some 40, 50 years previously, and he points out the discrepancies. This is his way of telling us that he is a modern traveller equipped with the camera and able to bring back to the West a faithful depiction of what this land looks like. He no longer has to rely upon the hand and the eye, but he has a mechanical machine in which to accurately transcribe the world. Yet at the same time, he is troubled by the disappearance of a piece of relief from the same site, the former presence of which was attested to by Brosset's work, the same traveller, and confirmed for Lynch by an old priest, described as the custodian of the site, who reports that the relief has been stolen. Thus the traveller is caught in this contradiction. Armed with the latest technologies, he seemingly possesses an ability unmatched by his predecessors to produce an accurate transcription of the world. And yet that world has deteriorated, and the camera has arrived too late to preserve it. And we have in Lynch sometimes the figure of the belated traveller. Here I'm using Ali Badad's work, the Western traveller who arrives in the Orient too late to see it, to see the Orient he's looking for. Lynch concludes that the relief is probably now lost in some museum. So the notion here is the museum as a site of disappearance, and it suggests the acquisitiveness of imperial travellers. By contrast, Lynch presents his own approach, what we might describe as his museum mode, as a benign form of collection. The camera, when possible, preserves its subjects, shielding them from the ravages of time, the elements, and human violence and greed. Others, however, see the camera as an instrument of intrusive knowledge gathering that is to be guarded against. This leads Lynch to moments of mourning, not only for the loss of culture, but also the loss of a good picture. Observing the ruins of 3 Armenian churches of Vazahan, present-day Turkey, Lynch writes of fine buildings now in ruins, a relic of the old times. What an eloquent memorial those shapely forms and that finished masonry still preserved to a cultured and beneficent race. But we had been placed under surveillance, and it was impossible to perpetuate the image of these decaying remains. So the presence of Ottoman officials stifles Lynch's work. But he goes on to advise the reader that for a visual rendering of the site, they should turn to a drawing made by Sir Austin Henry Layard, the British archaeologist, while on his way to Nineveh in 1849. So Lynch once more highlights a photographic stumbling block and defers to an earlier representation, while simultaneously appearing unable to actually omit photography from the equation. For he also reproduces a photograph, this one here, that he made on another occasion at a nearby site, the cemetery at Vazahan, essentially asking, with a noticeable sense of regret, for his readers to accept this image in place of the missing photograph. And you'll notice that this is the same one that I started with on the Hushamadian website. So this was originally for Lynch, a memorial to a lost picture, and now we see it's been with everything that's happened since, and in the memorial book genre, is now being used as a memorial to a lost land. And this is also a picture I took from the Hushamadian website, because I couldn't find the book in the library, so it's also, for me, a memorial to a missing book. Similarly, at Kars, he states that he would have liked to have photographed the citadel and the Armenian church there, but he was prevented by the number and ubiquity of the gendarmes from making any use of my camera. So his solution is to reproduce a photograph made by a friend of his, the biblical and Armenian scholar F.C. Conibert. The use of other photographs in circumstances where he is not able to make his own seems to attest to Lynch's belief in the necessity of photography, while at the same time he acknowledges the limitations of the medium and sometimes of his own powers. While I might talk about the photographic construction of the world, we see how the photographer is not always free to depict the world as he would like, but is involved in processes of negotiation and dilemmas of representation. Similarly, Lynch at times states a dissatisfaction with his photographs, such as in the Kurdish village of Gotni, on the Mush Plain, referred to as the first Muslim village where he was allowed to photograph women. He describes photographing one particular woman, whom he terms the belle of the whole settlement, only for the reader then to be informed in a footnote of this: my photograph of the belle of Gotni displays such a lack of good features that I must refrain from reproducing it for fear of belying my impression. In its place, I offer a picture of one of the best looking of her less flourishing comrades. So again, we have one photograph standing in for another, with this time it bringing into question the camera's capacity to transcribe the world. Or perhaps more accurately, the disparity between the reality of the camera and that of the photographer's own experience. But by and large, Lynch can be seen subscribing to notions of photographic fidelity and objectivity, especially when photographing people. His systemized approach to this kind of photography, the frontal view in shallow space, betrays a debt to 19th century anthropology and its close cousin, the criminal mugshot. And so people are rendered objects of curiosity, to be recorded, studied, and understood. Yet, despite the suggestion of control, we know from his accounts, as I've hinted at, his accounts of seeking and sometimes being denied permission to photograph people and places, that Lynch, again, was not always in complete charge of the image. And we have here the suggestion of something like Louise Pratt's contact zone, where subjects intervene in representational processes and have a say in what the final represents and how they are represented and seen by the world. Examining these photographs of people, we might make a further observation about Lynch's vision of Armenia. While Lynch saw no point in photographing towns and villages, he was happier photographing those that inhabited these spaces. And his subjects belonged to several different groups. They were Turks, Kurds, Greeks, and many different groups. So while the built environment is represented almost entirely by Armenian buildings, with a focus, as we've seen, upon Armenian churches being part of a process of identifying this place as Armenia, the human environment is depicted as being more varied. And Lynch is in little doubt that Armenia is populated by myriad different groups. So it was in part this issue of demographics that led Lynch to declare that this talk about a revival of the Armenian kingdom is windy and frivolous in the extreme. He also perceived a lack of leadership as presenting a bar to any possibility of the emergence of an independent Armenia. In the 19th century, he writes, when they broke loose from the expiring body of the caliphate, they had their princes and their nobles. These families have disappeared without leaving a trace. So again, in Lynch, we detect this tension running through his whole work, this fault line between two different Armenias, the historic and the contemporary, the glorious past read in stone and the impoverished present, which is often read in human bodies. And again, we might think back to that phrase of his, what a majestic and solemn country is yours. Lynch was one of the most prominent British pro-Armenian activists of the era, and like many, he embraced certain contradictions. He spoke against empire while being himself implicated in imperial power. He campaigned on behalf of the Armenians while maintaining an ambivalent Orientalist-tinged view of them, a view Jo Laycock maps out in her book Imagining Armenia. Such contradictions are often on display, such as when Lynch states, "We are surely simpletons if through motives of adventure and cupidity we fondly cherish the vision of this long-lost continent parceled out like virgin ground among ourselves. The Asiatic is not the African. He is our father, from whose lips we received our first lesson, and his old age, become almost childlike, contains the germs of rejuvenescence." So he puts forward an anti-colonialist argument while adopting Orientalist language and presents Armenians, along with other Asiatics, but with Armenians as his central focus, as an ancient nation, while at the same time infantilizing them. So Lynch could be fierce in his denunciation of Russian and Ottoman imperial rule, and exhibited a lack of interest in direct British colonial involvement in this region, and yet he remained, at the end of the day, a believer in the principle of empire, identifying with it a grandeur and a nobility that stood in strong contrast to the perceived pettiness and insignificance of the nation state. And this is probably his central criticism of the idea of an independent Armenia. Even if it were possible, he states, it would not be desirable. Reading Lynch, I sometimes find myself reminded of Edward Said's assessment of Joseph Conrad, of whom he writes, despite Conrad's attacks on empire, that Conrad did not give the sense that he could imagine a fully realized alternative to imperialism. Lynch argued instead for administrative reform, particularly of the Ottoman East, believing that improvement of governance would ameliorate conditions for Armenians and halt the Russian advance. Such reform, he hoped, would be promoted by an Asiatic department of the British government and would be based upon precisely the sort of expert knowledge of local conditions that Lynch saw himself as accumulating. So this is the classic 19th century view of the accumulation of knowledge in order to exert power. And Lynch's own particular idea was for there to be a construction of an Armenian state within the Ottoman Empire, along with a Kurdish state. And at moments like that, you see the relevance and importance of his mapping and his using his photographs to declare what space belongs to whom, because at the end of it, there was a certain political settlement in mind. But Lynch was also an advocate of trade and stresses the importance of the great highway of commerce between the ports of the Black Sea and the interior of Persia that passes along the avenue of the Armenian plains. And the mention here of Persia recalls a journey undertaken by Lynch in the 1880s, during which he navigated the Karun River, which resulted in his firm, the Lynch Brothers, inaugurating a steamer service and surveyed a new 270-mile trade route across the Bakhtiari Mountains to Isfahan, which became known as the Lynch Road. So his interest in Persia was put to one side during this period of roughly 10 years that he devoted to his Armenian project, but later returned to the Persian idea, coinciding with the Persian constitutional revolution and his election as a Liberal Member of Parliament in 1906. During this time, he headed the influential Persia Committee that endeavoured to muster public support for Persian independence and opposition to the British and Russian policies of intervention. So he had a different idea about Persia than he did about Armenia. He gained a reputation as a principled foreign policy dissenter, and yet a small whiff of self-interest also seems to have followed him around, with there being suspicions in some quarters that he had his own commercial interests in heart, commercial interests which were threatened by the Russian expansion into northern Persia. Whether this was fair or not, I can't say, but it seems clear that trade was a central aspect of his life and work. It often influenced his perspective. And in the Manchester Guardian, in its obituary of Lynch when he died in 1913, simply states in one short sentence, "Trade followed the traveller." So the focus of this was obviously Persia, but there is an element of this happening in Armenia as well. That what Lynch really believes in is trade and commerce and the expansion and protection of these things, particularly against Russian encroachment. And one of his great sadnesses in travelling Armenia is not just the ruinous sites, but also the fallow fields he comes across. He sees it as a great sort of dormant land that could be better tended to and used for the prosperity of its people. So there is a sense that trade, commerce, enterprise follow in his wake. But some of that may have caused him dismay and concern. The same Manchester Guardian obituary makes mention of the fact that a Russian translation of Lynch's book was published in Tiflis and used for the purposes of Russian commercial interests in Armenia, which, as I say, I can't imagine was the sort of commerce he had in mind. The potential for reuse seems written into Lynch's work. After all, he himself folds other people's images into his own narrative, an act that might suggest the potential for others to do the same with his work. Indeed, returning to that 1894 meeting between Lynch and Minas Tirez, we can see that this was also the occasion of an exchange of material. And shortly afterwards, Tirez was using some of Lynch's work as part of his own campaigns. Most notably, maps and images were incorporated into a show that Tirez toured through Britain, France, and the United States, described as a lecture, instructive and entertaining, illustrated by 51 limelight views on the Armenians, their country, race, history, religion, language, and literature. So this tells us something about the adaptability of photographs, but also demonstrates another aspect of the contact zone. With Lynch's photographs created as part of a narrative about Armenia, packaged for a Western audience, now being used by Armenians to tell their own stories about themselves. And this, it must be said, happened almost immediately in the mid-1890s, before Lynch really had a chance to do much with his own material. Tirez's narrative was not dissimilar to Lynch's, and yet it argued more forcefully for outside intervention in the Armenian provinces, with the activists urging direct British colonial involvement, including settlement, investment, and development. The narrative, it must be said, changed in accordance with its audience. In France, emphasis was placed on religion and the history of French intervention in Ottoman Lebanon, while in the US, Tirez played upon American ideals of liberty and the history of the movement to emancipate the slaves. In this way, we can see how Lynch's work entered a wider world of varied national narratives and political arguments. And I won't dwell too much on this, except to say that Lynch's work was again deployed after the Armenian genocide, particularly in 1919. We see, for example, chapter-by-chapter reprints of his book in The New Armenia, an American Armenian periodical that went towards supporting Armenian land claims at the Paris Conference, as illustrated by the map that inaugurated, and here we have the Lynch's chapter on Atama being one of the serializations, and here we have the map that was that opened every issue of the journal. So this, as you can see, the parameters of their Armenia deviated substantially from those laid out by Lynch. And there are also accounts of Lynch's book being republished in and distributed in Paris at this time by the Armenian delegates to the Paris conference. So they were, again, attempting to use this scholarship, this European scholarship, in order to promote their own aims and their own agenda, using the material but not feeling bound by the limitations that Lynch had actually placed on it. So I've said that the potential for reuse seems written into Lynch's work. Similarly, as has been seen through reference to his predecessors, Lynch acknowledges those that have gone before, thus locating himself in a history of travel. However, he goes further by also suggesting that others will in turn follow in his footsteps, introducing the figure of the future traveller as a kind of counterpart to his predecessors. Therefore, while he endeavours, as I've mentioned, to simulate the journey so that a domestic audience might partake in imaginative travels, he also thinks about the literal traveller, and to this end he also gives practical information and instruction, making his book at times not simply a travelogue, but a travel guide. For example, en route to Van, he writes, "I'm sorry that I'm not able to present a better description of the features of the country between Patnos and the Lake of Van. I hope that some future traveller will be able to ascend the sides of the hills along the trough of which we rode for many miles. I should advise him to devote at least 3 days to the journey between Karakalissa and Akants." So in a sense, Lynch invites us to follow in his footsteps, and this brings me to a few brief words about another aspect of this project. As mentioned, I'm in the process of recreating Lynch's journey, a literal revisitation. Now, this is new work that's still in progress, and I'm still unsure of how this all fits together. So while I describe it as another aspect of the project, it could well turn out to be an offshoot. I'm not sure whether we're dealing here with one large project or 2 smaller ones. But anyway, here we are back at the start of the journey in Kutaïs in 1893. And here we are in Kutaïs in 2016. Now, as to the reasons behind this, as I've mentioned, I feel as though this is one of the points of the book, and following Lynch through the routes and stages he lays out in his book is an amazing way of getting to know the work, the man, and the region. It can also be a way of further questioning his representational decisions. Why is it, for example, that he seems to have ridden straight past this? What I thought of as a very interesting Armenian church near the town of Kumbetli outside Kars in Turkey, named Vladikars in Lynch's day. And I think that essentially Lynch had, like all travellers, he had certain ideas of what he was looking for. He liked to present himself as a man going into the unknown to find out what was there, but he had certain preconceptions. We find out in the journey before this, we see that Ararat is a huge target of his, and after Ararat, it's Ani. Every part of the journey has its next stage, the destination. And after Ani, he seemed pretty much finished with Russian Armenia, so he raced along to the Turkish border, and this was on the way. So his next big stop was Lake Van, and he seemed pretty keen to get to Lake Van and to outrun the winter as well. So we see how certain things get left behind according to this image, this preconceived image of what constituted the place. There is also a sense that the future is a vital yet necessarily missing part of the book. I hope I've shown here how there is this conversation taking place between past and present, but the future also looms large, and the weight of the unknown, a different unknown here, the unknown of times to come, presses down on Lynch's book. Quite possibly this is reading it with hindsight, with the knowledge of all that has occurred since. But there are, I feel, substantial indications of this in the book, including Lynch's own early presentiment that the knot of politics was tightening around Armenia, and his display of the words of the 10th century Armenian historian John Catholicos on the title page of each volume: "Who can foretell our future? Spare me the attempt. We are like a harvest reaped by bad husbandmen, amidst encircling gloom and cloud." So to a certain extent, revisitation is about filling in the gaps, examining how the future played itself out on Lynch's landscapes and buildings. Sometimes, as I've done with the Kutaisi images, can result in some before and after images which may appear a little gimmicky, and that is not my intention, although sometimes these things can be enlightening. This helps us to, well, for me, to see how the project might be one of not only questioning Lynch's assumptions, but questioning my own. So here we are back at Tallinn, and it's amazing just how many buildings. I was expecting a lot of ruin and destruction, but it's amazing how many buildings have gone in completely the other direction. Furthermore, reading Lynch in situ, as it were, can provide an interesting perspective and oblique commentary on both his work and the sites as they stand today. Oh, and it also, sometimes it descends into a game of one-upmanship. Here's the church in Kars that Lynch could not photograph, so I had to photograph it for the simple reason that he couldn't. So reading Lynch in situ can provide interesting perspectives and oblique commentaries on both his work and the sites as they stand today. Take, for example, his stay at the village he names as Hoshavank while on his way to Ani. He writes of reluctantly delaying his advance to the medieval city he so longs to see after being told by villagers that he would not be able to reach his destination before nightfall. He then adds, "We discovered on the following day that they had deceived us about Ani with the express purpose of retaining us for the night." So putting to one side the employment of the trope of the cunning Oriental, this is an episode that provides an illustration of the sense of entitlement possessed by 19th century British explorers. The world felt to be theirs to explore as they pleased, but also a commentary on the lack of entitlement felt by Armenians today, for the village, now called Haykatsor, lies on the Turkish border. The church in the distance is in Turkey. So this is Turkey we're looking at here. While even the church in the foreground, while being on Armenian land, is largely out of bounds by virtue of the fact that it sits on the wrong side of the Armenian border fence. We were told by the modern-day residents of these parts, who seemed, it must be said, very nice, that the stately church, this one described by Lynch, is only accessible on special feast days. But a more prominent point of inaccessibility is further south, Ani itself, and also the monastery of Hormos, which is right here. Again, we're looking from Armenian land into Turkey. So it looks like it's just over the hill, but there is a gorge in between the two. And I was thrilled to be, Hormos was what I wanted to see along this walk along the Turkish border. And I was thrilled to be able to see it, even though you can't really see it all that well. It is there. So this is Hormos, the Lynch was able to visit once he had escaped from the clutches of the villagers. But unlike Ani, this place has not been reinvented as a tourist attraction and is effectively inaccessible even from the Turkish side of the border. And this is also a project about becoming a photographer. You can see I've captured this post remarkably well, but this one eludes me, but I'm glad to have got some of it. And I almost must thank some of the photographs of mine, but I had a friend of me, Sam Reed, who is, as you can see, a much better photographer than I am. So the good ones belong to him. And I think I will end there, but just on a brief story about this picture, where we were walking along the Armenian border fence, and others in the party got a little bored of my photographing and decided to wander back whence we had come. And I spent about 10 minutes with my camera hanging over a barbed wire fence trying to photograph this scene. I then wandered back to find the group parleying with some Armenian border guards that we had met earlier on. They turned out to be very nice Armenian border guards. We were worried at first when their opening line was, "What do you want?" which I took as a challenge, but others took as an invitation. So in the end, it turned into a very nice encounter. And there was I trying to capture Horomos, only to find out when I rejoined the others that in the middle of this conversation, the border guards were showing off their own pictures of Horomos, which of course had been taken much closer and so captured a lot more detail. So I think in a lot of what I encountered, this project is also about the telling of stories with images, as I saw at the Armenian border, of course, carries on. And I've got numerous examples of that. And the continuing telling of stories with landscape and with buildings. I mean, one of the stories of Horomos, I feel, is the way in which this is not just destruction. This is not Turkish destruction as Lynch characterized it, but this is another way of telling stories with buildings and with lands. The vandalism of sites, the closing off of space, these are all narratival techniques, much as Lynch himself was employing 125 years ago. And it also shows us how photographs, we have so much more at our beck and call these days, but photographs still very tricky things. The border guards were kind enough to give us, through the wonders of technology, transmit their photographs to us. But the last thing he said was, please don't put these on the internet. So since this is being filmed, I can't actually show you the pictures. So photographers continue to construct the world, but they are also still constricted by it. I will leave things there. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, David. Will you just take your own questions?
Please.
Thank you for that really interesting talk. I was curious, since you were describing the future traveler, did you see any sort of similarities or connections?
Please use the microphone.
I was curious, since you were talking about the future traveler, if you see any similarities or connections and how these same spaces are photographed and narrated today, besides the work that you're doing. Is there kind of an afterlife of the belated traveler that you see? And if so, what does that tell us?
Yes, I'm still getting to grips with this, but yes, the idea is definitely not to stop with Lynch, but to think about how his photographs have been appropriated and reused over the years, and also how look at the images constructed by other travelers to the region, and how the region continues to be pictured, both by people going there and by people using the photographs that are produced there. And yes, certainly, I mean, we can especially talk about images of destruction. As I say, in a way, I'm questioning my own assumptions, because I was expecting to find I was assuming to find destruction. And in a way, I'm not the belated traveler, because I was, like Lynch, I had certain things I was looking for. So I thought I was going in search of destruction, whereas actually I found a lot of creation as well. So we still go abroad with our own idea of what we're looking for, but often we find it. And especially, I mean, the most interesting figure for me at the moment is the Armenian or the person of Armenian descent and there are a lot of these journeys and expeditions around old historic Armenia, which are returns to homeland. They are returns to the family village or the region or particular sites, but they are also general tours of the loss of Armenian culture, and they are also photographic tours. They are constructed with an idea of creating images of wanton destruction. And again, maybe we're not so far away from Lynch's ideas. They can be. I'm not adding much nuance here, but there is a risk of them being pilgrimage in search of Armenian creation and Turkish destruction. So in a sense, we still have a lot of these same things going on, and possibly we don't surprise ourselves as much as the belated traveller found himself surprised. But of course, the belated traveller was always trying to get over the real Orient he found. So it's always a question of how we deal with the spaces we find. Okay.
We ask that you use the microphone for recording purposes.
Yeah, that was really interesting. I have some questions then about the companion text. There's obviously a lot of text with it. And I was kind of wondering about the sources. There were, footnotes, and also there was information about the inscription, which has been collected and, translated, and it shows, and then history. And so I was wondering about the kind of domain of scholarship in which he's working, because it's just about this time, and I really don't have the dates in my mind, but Josef Strugowski is writing, of course, about these Armenian buildings, and it's not just that these churches are Christian, but they are the origins of iconography, and that you cannot understand the Romanesque art of the West without knowing the Armenian input and so on. So they're being put into a new controversial art historical narrative. And I would imagine that wouldn't come in, but it made me wonder about the sources. What is his kind of language base? What are the domains? Is he going into international scholarship, or is this really a matter of recycling English, British travelogues, and where maybe some of those could read other languages? Did he, have Armenia? Did he have German? Did he have French? Did he have, which languages did he have?
Yeah. No, it's interesting that you mentioned Strugowski, because yes, his work, I think, was just starting to appear as Lynch was on the verge of publishing this book. So I believe there is I don't think he mentions him, but there is mention of him in the immediate aftermath amongst people talking about Lynch's book. And certainly, yes, he gives pages and pages and pages of a bibliography, which is in itself quite unusual for that time. He is desperate to show his learning. He talks about all the time spent in the British Library. He is heavily reliant on British accounts, but he also looks at he also looks at other European travelers and other European scholars. He seems happy to leave the British Isles, but not Europe. So he definitely relies on, or he has the languages, and he relies upon European scholarship as the basis for his journey and his understanding of the place. And he certainly, yes, he does place scholarship right at the heart of it. The idea that he is. He's not just a traveller or an explorer. He is a scholar. He is building on the work of others that have gone before him, and he is contributing to it. He is correcting their work where he sees it wrong. This is one of the great things about the camera for him. He can correct the fallacies and the misapprehensions of those that have gone before him. So he certainly sees himself as contributing to political knowledge and academic knowledge, certainly.
David, thank you very much. I have a question about how Lynch's project related to the past, in light of your representation of it as telling stories and your own following of the itinerary set by Lynch. So two questions. One, does it fit into a pre-existing genre of travel literature? Was there a publication on this region in particular. I've become aware fairly recently of a large, apparently very popular genre of 19th century publication that is essentially armchair travel literature, pre-photographic. So color plate books that are lithographic or engraved, which are covering land, buildings, costumes across the world. So one question is he himself following somebody else's itinerary in selecting the sites? And secondly, who's financing Lynch? Because I found that these color plate books depend upon the commissioning and energy and funds from a commissioning editor, of which there were several in London, if he's coming out of a British context. So who's financing him, and is he following a script in a sense?
Thank you. Good questions. So yes, yes and no to the first part. He definitely has this sense of Armenia being an unknown place, a place that is almost dropped off the map, that he is not just there to explore it and to catalogue it and document it, but he is there to map it, he is there to put it on the map, he is there to bring it into the British imagination and draw British attention to it. A lot of attention was drawn in Britain to Armenia. His two expeditions, in between his two expeditions, there were the vast massacres in Armenia, which did a lot of work to bring that region to the attention of the British. But before he left on the first journey, it was still something that was just sort of bubbling around the sides. He constructed his own itinerary, and he mentions at various points his reasons why. He has particular places he wants to see. He also has places that he's been before and that he's wishing to avoid, but he has central Armenian sites that he wishes to visit. A lot of these sites, yes, have been visited previously. I talked about some of the other travelers to that region. So the other travelers, those where there was overlap between his travels and those that had gone before him, it was often in the sites, the famous sites, such as Ani. So Lynch was certainly not the first to get to Ani and document it. Several had been there before him. But for Lynch, what was different was probably a lot of the spaces in between, the connecting up of these different sites, and the construction of actually a fully imagined entity called Armenia, that he referred to as a country. Yes, he wasn't thinking about it as a political nation, but he was thinking about it in terms of a definite and distinct land, which was probably missing from the accounts of those that had been there before him and were, let's say, engaged in more focused activities at particular sites. So a lot of people had been there before, but a lot of it was very new. The second question was about funding. Yes, well, one of the fascinating things about photography and exploration at this time is that explorers are not just yes, they're bringing back images of their travels in order to edify, educate, in order to show off, in order to demonstrate their achievements. But what a lot of them are doing is also fundraising for their future expeditions. Their lecture shows are often fundraising events. Lynch, though I haven't come across anything like this for Lynch, he was an independently wealthy man. His family business in Persia, along the Tigris into Mesopotamia, was very, very lucrative. So he was a man of independent means. So it seems mostly to have been his own money that he put into this project. But again, possibly certainly with his Persian travels, those almost funded themselves because the knowledge gained from his Persian travels opened up new navigation routes for his steamship company. So possibly these journeys are supposed to fund themselves. His Armenian journey to a lesser extent. I think the Armenian journey was mostly bankrolled by him, and he did. No, it was. It's published. As far as I know, he worked with the publisher. It was not self-published. I don't know much about Longmans, Greens and Co., which is the publishing house. But yes, you're right. That should probably be looked into. But as far as I'm aware, they're a reputable publisher. Oh, sorry. Yes. Sorry, you're having to take over because I'm not. I'm not. Yes, please.
Thank you. I really appreciated that talk. I'm an Americanist, and so it should perhaps be unsurprising that I saw some real correspondences between the photographs you were discussing and photographs of the American West from a similar time period in terms of their his interest in both documenting these sort of large-scale landscapes and then also doing sort of ethnographic work of indigenous peoples. And so I was curious how you would situate his project in relation to other projects, whether similar photographic projects of the Near East or elsewhere in the late 19th century, and if you could say what was maybe idiosyncratic about his project in relation to others.
Thank you. Good question. Yes, no, that helps to situate it very well in what was happening at the time. Yes, there are a lot of, we can point to a great many formal similarities, and his project was in essence a survey project of the region as done in the American West, as you say, and in lots of other parts of the world. He was not, though, his endeavour was not one of colonial expansion. It was certainly a colonial expedition and colonial operation, but it was not one of pure colonial expansion. He didn't seem very interested in that at all. But elsewhere, it did have many similarities with the idea of the exploration of the unknown, the taming of the unknown, the bringing of the unknown into the drawing room of the Western viewer. And also what I find particularly interesting in these examples of Lynch not being allowed to photograph and being prevented from photographing at various points, there definitely seems to be an awareness in the Ottoman Empire and the Russian Empire of the meaning of photography, the idea of photography as a tool of colonial expansion, that where the explorer and the surveyor go, soon it'll be troops and the rest of it. So part of this concern about Lynch's photography, I think, is this awareness of the camera as a colonial tool, even though in this instance it wasn't quite being used in the way, it lacked the systematic nature of a lot of colonial expeditions, even though other colonial expeditions were undertaken under similar premises, and often with their own preconceived ideas of what they were looking for, and through showing barren landscape and backward-looking locals were creating a space ripe for colonial expansion. And this is not to say Lynch doesn't do that. He does all of that, except he doesn't seem that interested in actual colonial expansion, and there doesn't seem much of a market for it in Britain either. His idea does seem to be the building up of scholarship, of almost a penetration pacifique of this region, the building up of British influence and British trade in order to, that is how the land will be brought out of the Dark Ages rather than avert colonialism. Yes.
Thanks for your talk. I mean, to pick up on that point about colonial expansion, it seems to me a political dimension of all this is what the Ottomans and the Russians thought of it. And it also struck me that the creation of this notion of Armenia must have been quite contentious in some quarters. I just wondered whether you would like to, I mean, I wonder how he sees himself projecting this in the light of the fact that on the ground it was a contentious issue. There's the beginnings of a new kind of modern Armenian nationalism. And it's, of course, something that parallels a lot that was going on across the Ottoman and the Austro-Hungarian Empire, where minorities were beginning to have a voice, where there was this Western interest in these minorities and promoting them and documenting them and so on and so forth. And in some cases, of course, groups documenting themselves. So I think there does seem to be I'm sort of fascinated by kind of what's left out of this in terms of, his project at one level being quite momentous in terms of its implications. And then on the other hand, I just wondered whether you would like to reflect on the fact that there does seem to be a very big difference between his journey and your journey, which has to do with borders. And I would like to know what role borders played in his case. They don't seem to have been quite so rigorous as in your case. And it's also rather interesting that you're showing landscape where you really cannot see the borders. I mean, it's quite interesting that it obliterates the sense of border because of this strange, sort of slightly featureless landscape, which is very open.
Yes, thank you. All good points. Yes, you're right, this is a very particular moment. And in a way, we have Lynch putting Armenia on the map just at a time when the Ottoman Empire and the Russian Empire, to a certain extent, are trying to take Armenia off the map. Not that was, I'm not talking about a project of eradication at that point, but yes, the idea of a place called Armenia, just as the idea of other regions, nations within empire, were becoming more and more dangerous, and especially so for the Ottomans, less so for the Russians who were on the advance. Particularly so for the Ottomans, who had suffered more and more breakaways. So yes, this is a very particular moment, and it's yes, and more. Basically, Lynch seems to be his first journey. He's traveling at this very particular moment. In his first journey, these things are less problematic than they are during his second journey in 1898, which has taken place after the time of the Armenian massacres, which is, of course, wrapped up in Armenian nationalism and imperial suppression and the fear of imperial collapse. And Lynch, there is not only this concern about a nation, about the breakaway of nations, and this is why particularly Lynch sees this idea of a nation within an empire as being a solution, but this is the last thing they wanted, because this would introduce the idea of the existence of a nation, a space on the map that was then ripe for breaking away in the future. So there was a fear of these breakaways, and there is also the fear, as you rightly point out, there is this figure of the Western traveller, who, in a way, he's not very innocuous. There are plenty of Westerners in this region at the time, although fewer in the eastern region that Lynch was concerned with. But one of the things that his work is about is not just Armenia, but it is about Western intervention. It is about Western interest in this part of the world. And this is particularly the thing that empire feared. It wasn't just the people, the minorities as they became on the ground, but it was them getting attention, and it was the great powers interfering in that part of the world. And again, I might go back to concerns about what Lynch was doing and his being prevented from taking pictures. There is more and more this fear of what exactly Westerners were up to, and you can even talk about massacre and so forth as being a response to Western interference, and that the more that the West shows an interest, the more paranoid and the more paranoid empire becomes. And what was the next bit? Oh, borders. Yes, no, Lynch as the imperial traveller borders meant nothing to him really. Sometimes they're a bit of an impediment. He gets into an argument with a border official. There's some petty bureaucracy which he finds rather distasteful. People get in his way and try to stop him from doing what he wants. And he thinks he has a rather bad time of it. But really, yes, they mean very little for the imperial traveller in a way that the imperial border was something quite fuzzy as opposed to the national border and national and political boundaries today, which are far more secure and set in stone. So this is, an aspect of it. Sorry, Catherine, I think you were wanting to.
No, are you sure we've been asking you a lot of questions? I can always ask you privately. But
If you want to wrap things up, however you feel.
I'll just that as an okay. So I wanted us to move completely into a different direction. And I was wondering, maybe, is there a gain in thinking about mountains, in some ways what Alex is saying about, these kind of indistinct prairies, but, mountains outside of just Ararat, but also thinking about mountain climbing, which you started us with, right? And the ways, since you're interested in thinking about narrative strategies and a grammar of photography and the construction of space, I wondered, what if you would compare the way in which mountain climbing, I mean, he actually has pictures and photographs of these spaces where he's marking, and I wondered, is there any purchase in thinking about a construction of space through mountain climbing?
There quite possibly is, and I will probably have to leave this quite open-ended. The idea of mountains and mountain climbing is something I've only really started upon, so I'm only really starting to scratch the surface of the literature about this and the potential of that area of investigation. But no, certainly it does appear to be a very rich subject, and it is actually only recently that I really realized quite a lot of what was happening there. And I mean, it was one of the beauties of things like this is that the longer you spend with these things, the more you notice some of the operations at work. And so this is definitely, this is, as I say, I'll have to leave hanging, because this is certainly work for the future, yes.
And then thank you so much for this fascinating lecture.
Thank you.